The 22nd of February, 1732, George Washington was born in Pope's Creek, Virginia, in British America. He was born to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. He was the fifth child of his father and the first child of his mother. Young George spent the majority of his childhood at Ferry Farm, a place near Fredericksburg in Virginia. Though his father died in 1743, by that time George was only 11 years old. And even though he was only 11 years old, he already had inherited 10 slaves. George's stepbrother Lawrence, in whom he looked up to quite a lot, inherited Little Hunting Creek, and eventually renamed it to Mount Vernon. George didn't have a formal education, but he did go to the Lower Church School. There he learned mathematics, including trigonometry and land surveying, become a talented mapmaker. He also wrote a book for himself called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation, including more than 100 rules for social interaction. After the death of his father, Washington was fathered by William Fairfax, the father-in-law to his brother Lawrence. William's cousin, Thomas Fairfax, also gained interest in the boy, with Thomas Fairfax getting George a job in land surveying. He also received a surveyor's license from the College of William and Mary. Unfortunately, George's beloved stepbrother Lawrence got tuberculosis. They went to Barbados hoping that the warmer climate could do something to help. Though, unfortunately, it didn't, and Lawrence died. This is also believed to be Washington's only trip abroad. George also caught tuberculosis and smallpox, surviving, but it is also believed that it made him sterile. Afterwards, George leased Mount Vernon from Anne, Lawrence's widow, and also took Lawrence's spot in the militia. In October of 1753, Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, sent Washington on a mission out to the Ohio Valley to remove some French soldiers. Washington was also sent to make peace with the Iroquois on the way. When George arrived at the French fort, the French greeted him in a friendly manner. The French commander, Saint-Pierre, refused to leave, but he did provide Washington and his forces with food and winter clothing for their journey back to Virginia. When Washington returned, Dinwiddie promoted Washington. He then sent Washington to try and remove more French soldiers. But when Washington arrived, his soldiers fired upon the French. 10 French soldiers were killed, including their leader, Joseph Guillain de Jumonville. Washington and his forces quickly went to build a fort, predicting a French retaliation. When the French arrived, George's forces were quickly surrounded in the ensuing battle, and George was forced to surrender. Without knowing it, he had accidentally started the American front of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. After the battle, George was humiliated and decided to resign. But not too long later, George decided to come back and become an aide to General Edward Braddock. Braddock and his forces went off to fight the French. Meanwhile, Washington stayed at camp due to having dysentery at the time. At the Battle of Monongahela, 2/3 of Braddock's men were killed, including Braddock himself. Hearing of the news, George came riding into battle on a horse while he was still sick, giving all the soldiers enough time to retreat. After the battle, Washington's reputation was redeemed, and Dinwiddie gave him control of all of Virginia's military forces. But Washington wasn't respected by the British officers. Washington then went on to join the Forbes expedition, and also, for the remainder of the war, he defended a small area of land. In the spring of 1758, George met Martha Custis. Martha was the widow of a wealthy plantation owner who had died the previous year. The following year, on January 6, 1759, George and Martha were married. Martha already had 2 children from her previous marriage, and even though they weren't his own, Washington treated them as if they were. In 1761, Anne, Lawrence's widow, died, giving Washington full ownership over Mount Vernon. Throughout the rest of the decade, Washington would oppose the British taxation policies. In 1774, George would be invited to the First Continental Congress. On April the 19th, 1775, the U.S. War of Independence would begin with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Soon after, the Second Continental Congress was formed, where they also formed the Continental Army. To lead the new Continental Army, John Adams and Samuel Adams decided to nominate Washington to be commander-in-chief. Washington, not wanting the job and also believing he was unqualified, reluctantly accepted it. But at the same time, every time he was going to the Continental Congress, he was wearing his military uniform. So that is debatable. But alas, the start of the war did not go well. In early 1776, he freed Boston. He then lost the battles of Long Island and Kips Bay. He managed to win at Harlem Heights, but then lost at White Plains, Fort Washington, and Fort Lee. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. Without Washington, of course, because he was still too busy fighting. But could they really not have waited for him? Although it was a big morale boost for the soldiers. On the 26th of December, 1776, Washington and his armies crossed the icy Delaware River, while at night and while there was an ongoing winter storm. This was also that they could get a surprise attack on the Hessian mercenaries who were hired by the British at Trenton, who were hungover after Christmas. The Hessians didn't see the attack coming, and it was a decisive victory for the Americans. The victory at Trenton was a large morale booster for the American soldiers. Washington went on to win more battles in New Jersey, such as the Battle of Assunpink Creek and the Battle of Princeton. But on the 11th of September, 1777, the Americans lost the Battle of Brandywine, which allowed the British forces to take Philadelphia, which at the time was the capital of the nation. Although afterwards Washington would manage to get some victories during the Saratoga campaign. Suddenly a brutal winter kicked in. Washington brought 12,000 of his men quickly to Valley Forge. The conditions were horrible. They ran out of food and clothes, and up to 2,000 of Washington's 12,000 soldiers died, which is a whole sixth of his men. Even with the poor conditions, very few soldiers deserted. But by this point, the French were starting to support the Americans. Soon after, the Battle of Monmouth followed, notable for Charles Lee's retreat. The battle pushed the British out of Philadelphia. Finally, on the 19th of October, 1781, after decisive American victory at Yorktown, the British surrendered. The war had finally ended after many years, and Washington had become a war hero. On the 3rd of September, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. One of the many. The terms of the British surrender were figured out, and British delegates decided that they were too embarrassed to be in the painting, so that is why there is a empty spot there. Washington was finally able to return to Mount Vernon after being gone for 8.5 years. Although by this point both of his stepchildren had died. Although they had children, and now he had great stepchildren. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention was called, where the Constitution of the United States was signed. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton then approached Washington and essentially bugged him into running for president. Washington was unanimously voted in, with Adams being chosen to be vice president. On the 30th of April, 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States of America. Washington assembled a cabinet, with Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as the Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as the Secretary of Justice. otherwise known as the Attorney General. Washington was against political parties, but that didn't stop Alexander Hamilton from forming the Federalist Party and Thomas Jefferson from forming the Democratic Republicans. Notably, Washington decided to stay neutral during the French Revolutionary Wars. Washington was then somehow convinced to run for a second term, even though he hated his job and just wanted to go home to retire. Once again, he won unanimously, and John Adams was once again picked as vice president. During his second term, he also created the U.S. Navy. Finally, in 1797, George was able to retire. He decided against running for a third term, but then everybody interpreted that as him saying that you should only have at max 2 terms, but no, it's just him hating his job. And George was finally able to spend the rest of his life with his wife and retire. But not for long. President John Adams comes in and hires Washington as Commander-in-Chief to the U.S. Army. On the 14th of December, 1799, George Washington dies a horrible death as his doctors try bloodletting because that's a good trick, leading to Washington's death. He was 67 at the time, and after Washington's death, his wife Martha decided to release all of his slaves, even though in Washington's will he put that his slaves should be freed after Martha's death, not his own. If you've enjoyed this video or find it interesting, it would be appreciated if you would subscribe, or if that's too much, like, or if even that's too much, you can just do none. But I spent quite a long time doing this video, and it would just be nice to have the support.